What's the unlock code? Unlock code? Or I can say click forward. Good morning. Great to see everyone here today. We'll get things rolling here. Come on, come on. Perfect. Thank you. Well, clearly the word got out that I'm speaking this morning. I can tell by the attendance. We went from last week of 127 to this week probably below 50. So no, I was looking around to see visitors here, maybe some online, but if you are visiting with us, I do welcome you. Our low attendance, I would hope, at least is what I'm telling myself, is due to camp this week. And a lot of the folks that are over there in more southwest Missouri, which we've been praying for, have a great week, safe week, and certainly praying for Becky and Ryan Boyer and everything they do here, and everything they do as part of the FCMO camp for this state. It's amazing what goes into that. And despite all the challenges that have come our way, being able to continue our worship and our learning in God's Word in as safe as we can possible, I know that's top of mind with them, and continue to keep them in your prayers all this week, as they're doing their camp. And I know here we are, at least for St. Louis County, coming in on another mask mandate starting tomorrow. But when I first heard that, I kind of rolled my eyes and said, here we go again. But quickly I was like, hey, we're ready for this. We have been there. We've done that over the last year. We've made a lot of changes in our structure here to accommodate and be flexible and be safe. And so it's good. It's good we've got that in place, and we can continue our worship even here through whatever challenges come our way. What the topic here this morning with and can you hear me okay? Everybody's nodding? Okay. So extreme ownership of Christians. I alluded to this in an invitation I gave here a couple weeks ago about a book that I have been reading. And that book is titled Extreme Ownership, How U.S. Navy SEALs Lead and Win. And it is written by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. A picture of Jocko here. I'm sure if you saw his bio, it would be likes long walks on the beach and puppies and all those, and really admired by women, as you can see here in this picture. But really, this guy is pretty decorated, pretty impressive, and probably not one you want to meet in a dark alley. But this book has one that the company I work for, we've adopted this year as part of our theme. For a lot of our rollouts that we do this time of year for the next season. And it's because in this book, it's really interesting. It's about a task unit, Navy SEAL task unit, that actually true stories of their challenges and learnings from failures in this town in Iraq called Ramadi, which is, if you've heard of this town, was not, and probably still isn't. It's probably safer today, but it certainly was a really extreme, unsafe territory and owned by a lot of the terrorist groups. And so the whole book is around the experiences they had as these Navy SEALs were coming in and trying to take back the city and really train up the Iraqi soldiers. And so they go through a lot of examples of what they experienced and how they approached it, and then they bridge that to the business world and how these techniques and things that they did can actually be applied in the business world. And they actually, Jocko Willink has a company where they do a lot of this, and they came and talked to our organization. And what I want to do this morning is take a chapter out of this book and apply it here to our biblical world, us as Christians. And so that's really kind of leaves a little bit of an intro or preface to today. Maybe first, just to ground us in ownership, right? When you think of extreme ownership, what are we talking about? Maybe what comes to your mind when you think about ownership. I try to just bring a simple example. Here is a picture of a 1955 Chevy pickup. And for that pickup to look like it does there, like it just came off the manufacturer line or floor. For that pickup to look like that today in 2021, someone would have had to take extreme ownership on the care and the maintenance of that particular vehicle for it to be in that kind of condition today, right? They had to take responsibility for maintaining it and doing whatever needs to protect it. And so just a very simple example to maybe ground us in this term, ownership. What does it mean to us? And maybe you have some of your own examples that you can speak to. But I want to first start in looking at some biblical examples of where there's not taking ownership, right? Where are some examples in the Bible where we see individuals being addressed or trying to be held for their accountable and they don't take ownership? We don't have to go very far. If you look in Genesis, quickly you see probably the first ever example of not taking ownership with Adam and Eve. We all know the story of Adam and Eve, so that one shouldn't be new to us. And we know that the devil is coming in the form of a serpent and convinced Eve to partake of the tree of life, which she was instructed not to do. And she does that, bites an apple, then convinces her husband Adam to do the same, which he does. And so in Genesis chapter 3, verse 12, this is where God is in the garden and he's looking for them, like, where are you guys at? Why are you hiding? And he finds out what happened, he knew what happened, and he confronts Adam. And in verse 12 it says, the man said, well, the woman you put here with me, she gave me some of the fruit from the tree, and I ate it. Right here, classic example right out of the gate of the blame game. Men blaming the woman, right? Still today, ladies, this happens. At least that's probably what my wife is going through her head right now. But truly, Adam could have really just said, hey, you're right, I messed up. But he didn't. He diverted it over to Eve. Another example. If we look in Exodus 32, this is another one we're probably very familiar with, Aaron and the golden calf, right? So in this scene, we know Moses went up to get the 10 Commandments. He's up talking to God. He leaves Aaron in charge of all the people that he just brought out of Egypt and says, hey, take care of these people. I'm going to be gone. I'm going to talk to God. I'm going to come back. And so he comes back to what? Chaos. I mean, people that had completely lost sight of God and even of Moses. And so Moses comes to Aaron and he says here in verse 21, what did these people do to you that you led them to such great sin? Right? He doesn't say, what are these people doing? He says, Aaron, what did they do to you that you led them to great sin? And what's Aaron's response here? Hey, don't be angry, my Lord. Aaron answered, you know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. And so I told them, whoever has gold and jewelry, take it off. And they gave me the gold, and I threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. Now, as I read this story this weekend, there was a couple things that I had to chuckle on, even though the story's a serious one. You know, one is where he says, as for this fellow Moses. Like, really? This fellow? I'm just like saying this fellow Joe Biden or this fellow Warren Buffett. I mean, who? You don't know him now? I mean, this guy just led you out of Egypt and quickly you're, some fellow. And then the second one was Aaron's response here where he's like, hey, they gave me the gold. I threw it in the fire and poof, out come a golden calf. It was magic. I mean, I'm sure there was much more involved, even of Aaron, in constructing that. And so at the end of the day, I mean, what does Aaron do? He shifts the blame on the people. Right? It's the people's fault, not me. It wasn't my fault. If we look at Genesis 16, back in Genesis, Sarai and Abram, pretty extreme example of lack of ownership. In verse 1 in chapter 16, it says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Right? Verse 1. It's the Lord's fault. Go sleep with my slave, perhaps, and I can build a family through her. So Abram agreed to what Sarai said, and after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave, Hagar, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. And and he slept with Hagar, and she conceived. And when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And then Sarai says to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. So, and we know if you continue reading that she starts treating the slave bad, and the slave runs away. But what is Sarai doing here? I mean, it was her plan. She's the one that laid this out. She's the one that told Abram and told the slave was her slave, so she had no choice. And all that got fulfilled based on Sarai, and she says, wow, now what's happening is your fault. Another in Jeremiah 31, starting in verse 27. This is where we see, the days are coming, declared the Lord, when I will plant the kingdom of Israel and Judah with the offspring of people and of animals, just as I watched over them to uproot and tear down and to overthrow, destroy, and bring disaster, so I will watch over them to build and to plant, declares the Lord. In those days, people will no longer say, the parents have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. Instead, everyone will die for their own sin, and whoever eats sour grapes, their own teeth will be set on edge. So here it's interesting, this sour grapes and teeth deal, right? These are people saying, and it's an interesting kind of metaphor where they're, I'm blaming my parents for eating these sour grapes. That's why my teeth are crooked. It's like, really? I don't even think that's a thing. I mean, maybe your teeth are crooked because you ate a bunch of suckers like this kid, or maybe you just didn't take care of them, or why don't you own up to your own actions? And so this is where God says, hey, no more. No more going forward. We need to be accountable for our own actions, and we need to take responsibility. The last example is in 1 Samuel 15, and this is verses really 1 through 33. I'll kind of skip around, won't read all of this, but this is where Samuel comes to Saul, and he says, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came from Egypt. And so here's the instruction. He says, now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put them to death. Men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Right? He's describing total annihilation here. And so if you keep reading, Saul gets the army together. He does approach the Amalekites. He starts wiping them out. But what does he do? Well, he spares the king. He puts him in bondage. He grabs all the sheep and cattle for himself. And his plan is to give them as a sacrifice to the Lord. And so Samuel finds out about this. And God's angry. Samuel goes to confront Saul. When he's trying to find Saul, somebody says, well, hey, he's not here. He's set up a monument in his own honor. And then he's gone down to Gilgal. And so by the time Samuel gets him, Saul immediately sees Samuel and says, the Lord bless you. This is in verse 13. The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. But Samuel said, well, what's this bleating of sheep I hear in my ears? Right? You're hearing this as Saul's talking to him. What's this lowing of cattle that I hear? This all this is in the background. He's saying, what do you mean you carried out the instructions? And Saul answered, well, the soldiers brought them from Amalekites, and they spared the best sheep and cattle to sacrifice our Lord your God, but we totally destroyed everything else. And Samuel cuts him off. He says, enough. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And he goes into describing these consequences. He says, tell me. So Saul says, well, tell me. And Samuel says, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you wipe them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? And here's Saul, right? He's still kind of defending. But I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission of the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. Ding, ding, ding. Shouldn't have done that. The soldiers took the sheep and cattle from the plunder. Ding, ding, ding. Shouldn't have done that. The best of what we were going to devote to God in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. But Samuel replies, does the Lord's delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. And because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And so Saul then says to Samuel, I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of men, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back to me so that I may worship the Lord. And Samuel says, no, I'm not going to do that. Now, this sentence of Saul's response here, Saul finally, it sinks in, right? He's getting confronted pretty heavily by Samuel. Now, I don't know, the hard part in the Bible is inflection. I could read this sentence some different ways. Let me read it to you this way, of Saul's response. So, Saul's response, hey, I've sinned. I have violated the Lord's command and your instructions, but I was afraid of men, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. Was that kind of how he approached it? I don't know. But he certainly had not just, I was wrong, stop, period, quit digging the hole. It was, I was wrong. The men, this is what happened, and come on, let's go. So again, Saul's not really taking ownership of the situation here. What about in our lives today? Do we take ownership? Many of us that at work, maybe we lead a team of people. Have you ever had a project fail? What do we do? What about our kids that break something at our house? I know what my kids do. Is Morgan? Is Cole? Wasn't me. What about us adults? If we were in the parking lot, we ding somebody's car. Like really ding. Not just you wipe it off and you can't even tell. Like really ding them. What do we do? What if you're called out in a gossip? Hey, Chad, so-and-so told me that you said this about me. Is that what you said? How do we respond? The challenge is consequences, right? Why do we do this? With consequences. We're fear of the consequences. If I'm leading a team that fails, I might get fired. If my kids break something, they might get a whooping, right? If I ding a car in the parking lot, man, I got to call the insurance company and I got to deal with this frustrated person and it's going to cost me money. And what if I'm called out in gossip? Well, now I got to maybe work with this person or they're going to be frustrated at me. I'm going to lose their trust. It's consequences why we do this. In this book, Extreme Ownership, Jocko Willink, that was leading this whole operation, the mission was laid out, the groups were trained, they had different groups going different places, and as you can imagine, a city of Ramadi is, probably not like Ellisville, right? It's chaos and buildings, and, there probably wasn't a very Google Map structure for mapping, and it was hard. And in the story, in one of the first chapters of this book, he talks about how there were basically a group that were converging in on this building where they had said they had the enemy, the bad guys, trapped. But man, they were putting up a fight. And the reason they were fighting this group of bad guys was because they'd shot one of their soldiers, the good guys, that was an Iraqi actually, because the Navy SEALs at this point were bringing Iraqi soldiers with them because they had to train them up so that someday Ramadi could be self-sufficient and they'd have their own team of Iraqi soldiers to defend it. And one of them had been shot. And so obviously that's not good, and that raises the hair on everybody's neck. And so they're out to get this group. Well, something didn't add up with Jocko being kind of the lead of everything. It was kind of chaos, right? Bullets flying and groups in different parts of the city. Come to find out, that group of bad guys was actually a group of Navy SEALs from his own unit. And what had happened was another group that had some Iraqi soldiers thought that they had seen somebody, and so they were approaching this building, and one of the people in the building misidentified one of the Iraqi soldiers and shot him and killed him. And so it was what they called a blue on blue, or what we might call friendly fire. Big deal. bad enough to get shot by the enemy, really bad to get shot by one of your own. And so Jocko in this realizes this, and they basically they clarify everything, they bring all the groups back, and this is where my mom's preaching to me as a young kid, the bad news will beat you home, occurred. By the time he got back to his base, the CO had already sent him an email and said him and an investigating officer are coming the next day, and they want a full debrief. A nearby town in Iraq had another unit with one of his buddies, had already heard about this, and he had emailed him and going like, what in the world? Was this under your command? So he debriefs with the team, breaks it all down. There was communication gaps. This team didn't communicate where their position was. They had moved, and they didn't say where they were. The team inside the building, they were supposed to communicate at certain time points, and they didn't. The person that shot the Iraqi soldier didn't identify him, or at least they didn't identify him accurately. Lots of things that they laid out. And so the next day, they get in a room with the CO and the investigating officer, and Jocko's leading this discussion, and he gets in front of his team with them sitting there watching, and basically you know why they're there. They're there to say, we want somebody held accountable. And Jocko basically launches in and says, what happened? Whose fault was this? I want to know. After the debrief we've done, the PowerPoint that we put together, whose fault was it? And one of them raised their hand and says, it was me. I misidentified the target. It was my fault. He says, you're wrong. It wasn't your fault. Another guy says, it was me. I was a communications person. I didn't radio in when I should have that we moved. That was my fault. He says, no, it wasn't your fault either. Another person said the same thing. Well, no, it was me. I missed the window for communicating. No. He goes, it was my fault. And he wasn't even in this place. He was the overseer leader. It was my fault. He took ownership in this story. And interestingly, in this situation, he didn't get fired. Matter of fact, the CO and the investigating officer respected him more. It was like, wow, he didn't pawn it off on somebody else. He actually owned up to it. And this team, what can you imagine his team thought? Wow, that was pretty bold. They had a lot of respect for him at this point. So that's really, to me, as I look at some of this, and I wanted to go back into the biblical examples of a couple here of really taking ownership. And it starts, one, Luke 15, 11 through 24, parable of the lost son. We know this parable well. This is where, Jesus continued telling his parable. There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. And so he divided the property between them. And not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and squandered his wealth in wild living. And after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. And so he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. And he no longer filled his stomach with the pod. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Now here in this verse 17 is where the son starts to take ownership. It says in verse 17, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And so he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long ways off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Period. It wasn't well, this happened. No, that's the end. And then this next piece is where we kind of see the Father's reaction. And we can kind of bridge this to our Father, our God's reaction. It says in verse 22, but the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found. And so they began to celebrate. We also get another example here in this parable. We get an example of how not to respond when somebody comes to their senses. If we keep reading in verse 25, it says, meanwhile, the older son was in the field. He's out there working. He never left. And when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. And so he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. And he says, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he sent him back safe and sound. Because he has him back safe and sound. And here's how we're not to react. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. And so his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you killed a fatted calf for him. And here's really the right response, right? The father, and how our father would respond. My son, the father said, you're always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He is lost and now he's found. Great example of 3:1, how our Father views this when you come to your senses and how we recognize and can take ownership. Maybe not at first. Maybe we don't recognize it first. But eventually coming to our senses, realizing our faults and taking ownership of it, and then how we react to that. The last one example here is David and Bathsheba. David and Nathan probably should be the more appropriate title there. And I've kind of compared this to the story we read about Saul earlier. So let me read a little bit of this that's in 2 Samuel chapter 12, kind of verses 1 through 14. As we do this, think about Saul and Samuel as we talk about here Nathan and David. So starting in verse 1, the Lord sent Nathan to David. And when he came to him, he said, there were two men in a certain town, one rich, one poor. And the rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. And he raised it, and he grew it up with him and his children, and he shared his food, drank from his cup, and it even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler come to the rich man. But the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for one who had come to him. Now here's David. David hears this story, right? David goes, he burns with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. And Nathan says to David, you are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. I anointed you king of Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all of Israel and Judah and all this. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah and the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Amorites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house because you despised, and he took the wife of Uriah and the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who's close to you. And he will sleep with one of your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all of Israel. Now here's David's reaction, right? He just got confronted. He just got called out big time. David says to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Period. See, David doesn't blame anybody else. He owns it, despite realizing, how hard this story must be when he heard it. Nathan replies, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this, you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. So this is an interesting reaction of God we see here that kind of represents a couple outcomes of sin. One is we damage our relationship with God. And the second is the harm that we compose on the world or to others. And in this story, God reconciles the first when David admits the sin, but there's still consequences that play out. And compare and contrast this to Saul. Very similar situations, right? Saul has Samuel come in to tell him this hard truth. David has Nathan come in to tell him this hard truth. they both end up realizing that, oh, it's pretty obvious it's me. I mean, they get called out on it. But Saul kind of argues. At first he says, whoa, I did what God told me. I did. I went and killed, well, I killed most everybody. I mean, come on. David had no argument with Nathan. And Saul, once he finally admitted and came to his senses, he didn't just say, I've sinned, it's my fault. Right? He went on to talk about the men and why, and well, it was this, and come on, let's just... David just says, look, I've sinned. My fault. You know, to bring things to close here, ownership, I see ownership today, it's a choice today. It's a choice for us, a choice for me. But it's not going to be a choice on Judgment Day. We know in Romans 14, 10 through 12, we read, you then, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or why do you treat them with contempt? For we all stand before God's judgment seat. It is written, as surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow before me, and every tongue will acknowledge God. So then, each of us will give an account of ourselves to God. See, on Judgment Day, we're all going to give account. We're all going to be taking ownership. And we have the opportunity, as we close out here, part of giving your life to Christ and being baptized into Him is taking ownership. Right? You're repenting of your sins. You're taking ownership for those. That's part of the process of becoming a Christian. And so at this time, if there's any need of anybody to do that today, to come forward and give your life to Christ, we leave this time set aside for that. Or if you want to come forward for prayers of the congregation, you can do that as well as we stand and sing.